Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Catholic Culture Podcast. As you may have heard me mention before on this show, I used to be a libertarian, and I was a libertarian up until the point at which I started reading Catholic social teaching and realizing the two weren't really compatible. But I remember at the time I was a libertarian and into the Austrian School of Economics. I used to get into debates with Catholic distributists. And I always kind of had the feeling that they were not really giving the fair due to the science of economics. They tended to have a suspicion of it as a science at all, or else they didn't seem to really understand when we were debating things about, say, the Austrian School of Economics, they didn't seem to really understand the principles that they were debating. They didn't seem to have really done the reading. In retrospect, I think that they were right about some things, but that experience kind of left me with a lack of interest in reading the original Distributist texts by authors like Hilaire Belloc and G.K. Chesterton, because I hadn't gotten a good impression of distributism from my encounters with contemporary distributists. So this new book that just came out from Catholic University of America Press seems to recognize that problem, and that's why I took an interest in it. It is The Political Economy of Distributism, Property, Liberty, and the Common Good, and it seeks to bring together what is of value with the insights of Chesterton and Belloc on distributism, the social order, with the insights of economic science, and to try to bring those together for both a practical and a theoretical cultural understanding of the issues that we're facing today with political economy. So I'm happy to have the author of this book here. Alexander William Salter is the Georgie G. Snyder Associate Professor of Economics in the Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University. He is the Comparative Economics Research Fellow at TTU's Free Market Institute and an Associate Editor of the Journal of Private Enterprise. And again, his book is The Political Economy of Distributism, Property, Liberty, and the Common Good. Alex, welcome to the Catholic Culture Podcast.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm glad to be here.
Now, from what I understand from your book, you are actually not Catholic. You are Orthodox, correct?
That is correct.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you got so involved in distributist thought, given that, as you point out in the book, this originates from two well-known Catholic thinkers, Belloc and Chesterton, but also who were very, very informed by the principles of Catholic social teaching as it existed at the time. So how did that come about for you?
It largely came about through my pre-existing admiration for Chesterton, who was very important for me personally in returning to the Christian faith after my years wandering in the wilderness as first an atheist and then an agnostic in college. So I had an appreciation for Chesterton's works, especially his apologetic works, and from there I found his works on distributism, his writings on politics and economics. And like you, I had some issues with that, given that I was an economist by training. I am an economist by training. And a lot of what he says, I don't think holds up in light of how we know that markets work. But that being said, I thought that it was wrong to just entirely dismiss Chesterton's perspective, because I thought at the level of institutions, right, not necessarily what markets do in terms of producing quantities of goods with prices and things like that, but in terms of the rules of the political and economic game, there was a lot that Chesterton was saying that I thought actually made some sense and could speak to contemporary social scientific inquiry. And so from there, I found Belloc. I started reading them. I started reading their political and economic works. I started reading about Catholic social teaching, and the rest is history.
Yeah. Well, I've read quite a bit of Chesterton, never read any Belloc at all. And I admire Chesterton for, the standard reasons, but, also sometimes find him a little frustrating. You had a line in your book that I'd like to quote. You said on Chesterton, "In making poetic arguments poetic, he helps us imagine a different world. Sometimes he becomes so absorbed in his vision, however, that he forgets where it ends and in reality begins," which I found myself saying almost the exact same thing about this kind of paradoxical style of his, specifically, that sometimes he gets so involved in paradoxes that he sometimes can't seem to tell the difference between a paradox and just an actual logical contradiction. But he's certainly worth reading. And I would encourage people who, have that same vibe from Chesterton to get over that at least a little bit and find the value in his work. But I was really interested in the Belloc chapters in particular. I found those very, very compelling, having never read him at all. We're not going to be able to get into everything that's covered in the book, obviously,
Sure.
but give people a teaser here. Maybe we should start with some of the important principles of distributism and then move into the economic territory.
Mm-hmm. So the book is motivated in its opening chapter by a lot of conversations that are happening right now surrounding American public discourse, especially on the American right, amongst those who would self-identify as conservatives. You have this conversation arising about national conservatism. You have this conversation arising about common good capitalism. And that was sort of my into the political economy of distributism, because I do think that the distributist way of looking at the world helps us adjudicate some of these claims that are made about the nature of markets, the nature of Republican small r politics, and how they relate to the American experiment in ordered liberty. So using those broader public conversations as my inroad, that's when I start engaging the works of Catholic social teaching that you can find in the works of the social encyclicals. That's when I bring in Chesterton and Belloc, since their work is explicitly motivated trying to think about political and economic institutional solutions to bringing about the teachings outlined in those encyclicals. And if I had to pick one insight that I think is important and worth taking seriously, it's the distributist claim about the relationship between ownership and liberty. Now, we have to spend a little bit of time talking about that word liberty, since it's not going to mean the same thing to somebody who's rooted in Catholic social teaching as it is going to mean to a more orthodox libertarian. So just for full disclosure, I do say this in the preface of the book, but I myself am a pretty orthodox libertarian. Nonetheless, I found it very interesting and fascinating delving into these ideas. Liberty to Belloc and Chesterton, and liberty to those who follow Catholic social teaching, is not merely absence of interference. There's an element of that, provided that the interference is coming unjustly from an authority that does not adhere to the common good and interfering in a lower order community in that way. But liberty has a necessarily intrinsic relationship to human flourishing. It means that you have the means and the ability to do as you ought, to fulfill your God-given duties. And so when we look at liberty that way and think about distributist freedom in that way, we realize that their claims about ownership, the incentives that come with ownership, the informational properties of a widely dispersed private property economy are such that you're really going to be able to maintain institutions that respect human dignity and human freedom, as Catholic social teaching describes it, if there's widespread access to productive property. That's the central distributist claim that I think has important implications for our institutions and political debates today, since ownership and the cares that come with it is not something that really enters into our policy debates anymore. The closest thing to it would be the push for widespread home ownership, by going back to the Bush administration, right? Everybody should own a home, everybody should be in a house. A lot of people have reservations with the way that worked out, given the 2008 financial crisis, but the distributists aren't really talking about one specific asset, a home. They're talking about when you actually own the factors of production that you use to earn your livelihood, how does that change that you view your relationship to the fellow people in your community? How does that affect your perspective on the world as a citizen? How does that affect how we deliberate with each other as equals in a community of equals? There's a whole lot of really interesting stuff that you can say for that notion of ownership and for that notion of liberty as Catholic social teaching understands it. And I think that looking at it that way shows that many of the political and economic problems that we have today can be made intelligible by saying we don't really live in an ownership society anymore, if we ever did.
Right. Well, I mean, there's a lot to be said about this, and like you, I found that to be the most compelling point, and particularly their conception of ownership and what kind of ownership they're talking about. And what I found when reading about Belloc's thoughts in particular, despite my kind of earlier in life, my suspicion of distributism, I found it pretty consonant, of course, with the Catholic social teaching, the foundational documents of Catholic social teaching that I've been reading over the past few years, and also with some social and cultural critiques made by people who might describe themselves today as post-liberal, and I fall sort of vaguely within in that camp. I would maybe describe myself as like a leonine post-liberal, something like that. I want to look at a couple of big picture things to sort of clarify this discussion of ownership and why it's important. One thing you mentioned in the book early on is when we're talking about common good capitalism, there's a problem with thinking of it in primarily economics terms or as like a third way between capitalism and socialism, which I believe I want to say John Paul II in Centesimus Annus actually even says that Catholic social teaching is not a third way. And particularly that we don't want common good capitalism to be focused on material comfort rather than human dignity. And like you, I'm very suspicious of things like universal basic income for that reason, despite not being a libertarian. And I think that there can be something of a myopic attitude towards the effects that certain policies will inevitably have on human dignity when you're just focused on material comfort. So that's kind of one aspect of the big picture problem that can clarify what we're talking about here.
Yes, I think that's right. So when you start to look at these social arrangements, do we want capitalism? Do we want socialism? Do we want some sweet spot between the two? The temptation is to focus on things like income inequality, consumption inequality, right? Figuring out how those sorts of things work. That's actually a very sterile way of looking at it. If you actually subscribe to the rich notions of human flourishing that come from Catholic social teaching, those really can't be your evaluative standards. Right? It comes with the general problem of loving humanity in the abstract without actually doing good to any actual flesh and blood people. That's not the way that these social systems are supposed to work. It's not necessarily, when you look at income inequality, for example, that's not necessarily a problem, but neither is it necessarily justified. You have to look at how the actual incomes in question are being generated. It's not exactly a great stretch to say that different productive activities can yield different incomes in line with the values of the citizens whom you're catering to. That's not particularly controversial. But in just looking at inequality for its own sake, oh, you have more, you have less, therefore you should have more, that doesn't get at the heart of the issue, which is the dignity of work, the act of creation, of acting on property in a way that creates value, these fundamental things that come with what it means to be human, an almost artistic exercise. That's actually central to some of Thomas Aquinas' arguments for private property. This idea that we have private ownership, so each person, each household really, has a sphere of activity which is its own, so they can practice their talents and develop their virtues, where virtues just means ethical habits. And so we need to reorient our way of thinking, if we care about these issues, away from the popular narratives of, again, can you consume as much as your neighbor? Do we want to increase this transfer payment? If all you're doing is giving somebody a check, that does not comport to dignity and that does not comport to security. A government transfer payment is just as precarious as a job that might be outsourced.
And also, I mean, this is maybe an ancillary point, but the desire to create a just society that supports those who are in need and can support themselves and things like that shouldn't be combined with a desire to create a society that's devoid of risk. And I think, I don't know, that was one thing that kind of pushed me in a libertarian direction. Was I have this very fundamental aversion to the idea of creating a society that is where things are so sterilized, to use a word that you used, that we are attempting to eliminate all risk, whether it's economic risk or other kinds of risk. And that's not the same as not wanting a government that is promoting the common good. But I think that when we try to sort of we have to have a delicate hand in creating policies that are going to foster things without kind of smothering them, I guess. And that's kind of another thing that economics as a science can help with.
I think that makes sense. We have this intuitive idea that mitigating risk is just about controlling the variability in the natural environment, protecting against a bad crop, for example, or maybe mitigating the consequences of a natural disaster. And that's part of it, but really the phenomenon that we call risk comes from the fact that we have imperfect control not only of the natural environment, but of the other human persons who we exist alongside with in community. And we shouldn't want a high enough degree of control of other human persons to eliminate risk. That would require regimenting society in a way that necessarily stifles Christian liberty, love, charity, all these things that we care about. Whether the riskiness of your income is due to the fact that you're a farmer and then there's bad weather that year, that's one thing. Or it could be that patterns of specialization of other people trade such that people don't want your product as much as before. Well, if you want to insure against the risk of the second one, you're basically going to have to force people to do what you want them to do. You're going to have to bring control, coercion to bear on that social arrangement, which isn't to say that the state does not have some role in maintaining the common good by making sure that there is economic security of some kind. You can actually find that theme illustrated in the social encyclicals to varying degrees. It does mean, though, that we cannot view public policy as a means of alleviating us of the cares and responsibilities of living, because to do that would mean to exercise a degree of top-down violent control over other human persons that is quite simply inconsistent with the image of God in us all.
Right. Okay, and then to get a little bit more specific, you were talking about this focus on income equality and things like that. So what the distributists are concerned with is not so much redistribution of wealth as it is about the means of production specifically. And I don't remember if I have this in my notes. I don't remember if this is from the book or not, but there's an interesting point where, okay, well, the current regime, speaking very broadly, talks a lot about redistribution of wealth. It seems like they are not as interested in redistribution of the means of production or a wider distribution of the means of production. I mean, it seems as though everything in sort of the large-scale corporate worlds and in our government is to basically give people more comfort while stripping them of responsibility. Obviously, something very connected to human dignity. And really to take away the option of questioning, the kind of life that I want. In other words, if it's harder and harder to, I might have a better and better quote unquote standard of living in terms of purchasing power, another term that you use in the book that you distinguish from the kind of concerns of distributists. But it might also become more and more difficult to actually really decide my own destiny while doing that, because I'm totally dependent on being somebody else's employee, or I am totally dependent on the system of exchange. And these are things that we can't get rid of these interdependencies totally, nor should we want to. But when there's so few people in society who are, for instance, even growing their own food or know how to do that, then it leaves you increasingly dependent on either the state or on large corporations that might as well be the state for all practical purposes. Does that sound right?
The distributists pay a lot of attention to independence because what they're afraid of primarily is dependence. Not in the sense that everybody is an autonomous self-starter, right? That's not the distributist vision. But the distributist vision is that each authentic human community, from the family to the neighborhood to the town, all the way up to the level of the state itself, and this is where subsidiarity comes into play, each authentic human community has the means to sustain itself and flourish as a community. And that's necessarily going to mean that you need households to have an incentive to buy in, to have a stake in the social order. And the distributist claim that I find most interesting is that those incentives come with ownership, but not necessarily the employment relation, not necessarily forms of capital ownership that we take for granted today. And one reason that I think that we need to care about this is because to the extent that public policy bears on these questions at all, it's massively stacked the other way. This is an interesting area of agreement potentially between those who are informed by distributism and more standard libertarian types. It is unquestionable that the playing field is rigged in favor of bigness. The complexity of the tax code, the complexity of the regulatory code, licensing arrangements, occupational restrictions, What kinds of entities are going to be able to cope with these and be able to flourish if those are the rules of the game? Obviously, it's going to be the giant firm that can afford a full-time legal, accountancy, and lobbying team, rather than smaller, more localized arrangements. This is stacking the deck. This is just an example of crony capitalism, structuring the rules of the game to favor the big, already established and well-connected at the expense of more independent enterprises. And so insofar as that infringes on small L libertarian liberty, that's obvious why libertarians find that objectionable. But you can find that objectionable from the standpoint of Catholic social teaching too, because it's depriving actual flesh and blood persons of the means that they could use to participate in the division of labor, to sustain themselves, to provide for their families, and ultimately to participate in community.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk a little bit more about Belloc and some of his ideas. Well, one of his most important works on this is The Servile State, and he talks about free versus servile labor. And it took me a long time to really have an understanding of what that idea. I mean, distributists today will talk about wage slavery quite a bit, right, for instance. And I always kind of scoffed at that idea because I thought, well, nobody's coercing you. I was looking at these things in a very, this Rothbardian kind of notion of coercion in a very strict, almost like physical sense. But when it comes to, if you're looking at things in terms of freedom for instead of just freedom from, then coercion can begin to take on a broader sense, insofar as you're seeing the end result being that people are not actually free to flourish and to have like an appropriate degree of independence in the ability to sort of make choices and to negotiate on, if not an even playing field, then a playing field that is even worthy of being called a playing field. So what is this? How can we understand this idea of a wage slavery or free versus servile labor? Like, how would you try to convince somebody coming from, say, a libertarian perspective who was skeptical of the very idea and thought that this was just an abuse of language to talk about things this way?
Those are great questions. I myself am skeptical of the phrase, the idea wage slavery specifically, not necessarily because of the lack of the classical Misesian Rothbardian coercive aspect of it, but just because I don't like analogizing things to slavery that aren't slavery, given how inhumanizing and just totally awful actual slavery is. That being said, I think the way to understand Belloc here first is to understand that he was making a very specific prediction about the trajectory of labor markets in the early 20th century in Great Britain. He actually thought that we were going to, by we, I mean Great Britain at the time, was going to progress to a point where so many workers were dispossessed and labor markets were so dysfunctional that the state was going to have to eventually step in and basically order idle excess laborers into specific lines of production, where basically the state was going to have to take over the actual allocation of labor. Now, clearly, nothing on a large scale like that Belloc has predicted outside of war, nothing like that has actually taken place. So in that sense, Belloc made a prediction that's been largely falsified by experience. I think that he underestimated, just descriptively, not necessarily in an ethically desirable way, but just descriptively, the ability of labor markets to be coordinated by the wage mechanism, the price of rented labor. Where I would try and rehabilitate Belloc's views is this idea that even if you're getting paid a very good wage, you're still a wage laborer. You are still not necessarily owning the factors of production that you use. And so that's going to mean a degree of dependence on somebody else's capital structure, which can be great for your living standards, right? Wages can be very high. In fact, they've gone up and up and up over the past 100 years since Belloc wrote. But the incentives that come from that kind of an economic relation are fundamentally different than the incentives that come from, I am a member of a productive household, we own capital, we own other factors of production like natural resources, we engage in some small-scale enterprises, and ultimately we are our own economic/productive unit. Now, a lot of people scoff at that as a degree of romantic fancy, and I myself am skeptical that anything like that model is replicable in this day and age. My point as an economist is simply to say, but we can't ignore the difference in incentives that comes with, right? To the extent that we care about sustaining small r Republican institutions where we actually deliberate the course of public policy rather than just like hand down solutions from on high and force them on everybody, you need to have public discussion in a community of equals. You basically need a community of people that are more or less on the same footing in terms of power, in terms of ability to reason together about the common good, what it requires, and to pursue it. It's pretty clear to me that whatever the other virtues of the United States government at its various levels today, that does not characterize us. It's much more administrative. It's much more the province of a narrow few. It's much more done behind closed doors for the interest groups that are actually at the table rather than for the common good of the community itself. And so you have to recognize that there may be a trade-off here between living standards that we all want, right, and actual sustainable political liberty. And again, liberty should not be defined merely as the absence of coercion, but the prerequisite conditions necessary to flourish, where flourish takes its meaning from Catholic social teaching.
Right. Okay. So why is it then that wage labor might lead to a lack of flourishing, even if your income is high?
You definitely have a lot of material well-being in that scenario. But remember, one of the requirements of Catholic social teaching is that we flourish as persons in a community. Personhood is necessarily relational. I requires thou and thou requires I, which means that there should be a healthy civil society. There should be a lot of local, small-scale political and economic control. If you're working for a very large organization, as I am, right? So I'm doing this, as I am, and the conditions of your employment are largely determined by somebody else, if the remuneration for your employment is largely dependent on its rewards in a globalized marketplace that don't have any specific things to do with a localized community, again, that could be great in terms of your ability to travel, to accumulate financial capital, to enrich yourself in other ways, buy books, engage in art, learn an instrument. That's all well and good, right? But one of the things that you could be missing because of that is civic engagement. One of the things that you could be missing because of that is actual face-to-face relations on a humane scale of living in your local community. So that's a tension, right? Not necessarily an irreconcilable tension, but it is one that we need to pay attention to. And this is something Belloc explicitly says when he talks about large-scale corporate enterprises and their methods of production, right? He fully recognizes that large firms might be able to produce goods and services much more cheaply, meaning using up much fewer resources than other more localized, more small-scale craft enterprises. He says, though, you're getting cheaper goods in terms of money, but you're giving up something for that price. You're giving up community. You're giving up one of the most important ways that we heretofore have experienced to flourish as human beings. So perhaps there could be other things that we're getting in return. Obviously, we're getting higher standards of living. And let's not downplay the moral goods that we could get from higher standards of living, right? Wealthier nations means higher literacy rates, lower childhood mortality rates, all host of moral goods that really do matter, right, for human flourishing. But it's important to recognize some of the humane scale things that you are giving up when production, distribution, and political control over those processes take on the dimensions that they currently occupy.
These days, there's a lot more interest in the idea of independence because of the sort of recognition of the problems of woke capital, people wanting to be uncancelable, unfireable. There's an increasing awareness in some sectors, and I would say, including on the right, of kind of the dehumanizing aspects of urban living, or of what we were talking about just now, dependence on an employer, of not having continual contact with the most basic kind of sources of life, with the natural world, and with knowing where your food comes from, and all of those things. These are things that people actually all over the ideological spectrum are thinking about in various ways. Mm-hmm. But obviously land is a very important resource, not just the factors of production in general, in terms of, say, owning your own machinery for producing goods, or being, if you're a musician, running your own label or whatever it might be. But land in particular has this kind of central place for the distributists. And I myself, I think that the agrarian thing can be overplayed insofar as it's implied that this is what's going to save us all, or that everybody should be living like this and you should be basically growing your own food and self-sufficient. But what do you think, you were talking about the practicality of restoring a certain state of affairs, and what do you think is they're getting right there that's actually practically applicable to the modern day? In particular, and I'm particularly talking not about just the factors of production in general, but particularly about the agrarian life.
There is a strong back to the land aspect associated with all this, to the extent that the distributists were concerned with redistribution, actually taking some factor of production from somebody and giving it to somebody else. Land was the one that they were most likely to favor. Now, it's worth noting that the importance of land, and I don't just mean physical space on Earth, but also uncreated natural resources, land's importance for economic performance has comparatively diminished a great deal since Belloc's and Chesterton's time. I think land, including natural resources, landowners, natural resource owners only earn something like 10% of the national income, right? It was much higher in Belloc's and Chesterton's days. So we can't necessarily, you're right, take an agrarian back to the land perspective on all that, because that's just not going to be the form of the division of labor that jives with the patterns of specialization and trade that the economy has currently taken on. So I think that the right way to go forward is to take the distributist emphasis on productive resources and apply it to other things more broadly, rather than focusing narrowly on land. And again, a lot of this has to do with distinguishing what the distributists got right from what the distributists got wrong. I think that the wrong way to read Chesterton and Belloc is as a substitutes for an Econ 101 textbook. I don't think that you're going to find a very compelling theory about how markets actually work. I'm a big believer that there is such a thing as the science of economics, and that we have the foundations of that science, the basic stuff that we teach to, first-time economists. We have that stuff pretty much figured out as a descriptive body of knowledge about the way that things like prices, quantities of goods and services, the distribution of income, how these things actually work. So I don't think that that's where we're going to get our big takeaway from Chesterton and Belloc. Where we should look is their institutional imagination. Where we should look is the way that they thought about how we can actually build political and economic institutions, the rules of the game, to better promote the common good. And this is why I turn to somebody that we haven't talked about yet, an Austrian-born German economist by the name of Wilhelm Röpke, at the end of the book, because this is somebody who was heavily informed by the distributists and Catholic social teaching, although he himself was Protestant, not Catholic, who nonetheless was a first-rate economic scientist. To give you some background knowledge about Professor Röpke, he was one of the architects of the post-World War II German economic miracle. He was one of the small number of guys that basically rebuilt Germany's shattered wartime economy and helped set that nation on the course to become an economic powerhouse in Europe, while also building aspects of their what's called the social market economy, right? A basic safety net, plus giving the government significant power to curb things like monopoly and market power and that sort of thing. So in terms of actually existing liberalism, you mentioned post-liberalism versus liberalism earlier. I think it's interesting that the distributists, Chesterton and Belloc, both describe themselves as small L liberals. Belloc was a capital L liberal member of parliament. And of course, Wilhelm Röpke was firmly in the classical liberal tradition as well. In terms of what you can actually do for real world liberalism, rebuilding the economy of a war-torn nation ranks pretty highly up there. Based on his various ministerial posts, guys like Röpke did more for actually existing human flourishing than I'm probably going to do throughout my entire career of writing. And I'm okay with that, but we should recognize that these ideas can and have been put into practice. This is not just ivory tower speculation. There is work that can be done here, and we have precedents to draw on.
Right. Yeah, that's great. And I'd like to get into him in a minute. I wanted to talk, though, a little bit about the kind of the psychological aspect of distributism. And there's an interesting quote from Belloc. We cannot make men owners by we cannot make owners by merely giving men something to own. So that should hopefully round out some of our cultural discussion of distributism, because he's not just talking about, again, he's not just talking about the standard of living. So why is it that, what does he mean by kind of this implicit becoming an owner in a deeper sense?
I think it has to do with what we were talking about earlier in terms of having a stake in the kind of social order that actually promotes small-scale humane community. So you have to actually be on board with this idea that ownership is hard. The reason that most of us are not owners of businesses is not that we can't do it. It's not that we're being deprived, like in the sense that somebody has stolen property or capital from us. Especially given how easy it is to borrow money these days. The reason that most of us aren't owners, that we don't own our own businesses, is because it's really hard and we'd rather not to. It's very easy to be a wage employee. It's very easy to specialize in one small part of a factor of a line of production, earn your high wages, stock your 401k, and then basically go on living your life, enjoying a host of moral goods, right? But also at the same time risking belonging to nowhere. That's not necessarily a deal breaker in the sense of contemporary economic arrangements, but it does, again, suggest this tension. How are you going to realize the human level relationships that Catholic social teaching prioritizes if that's the kind of economic life that you want to lead? And again, this is something that pretty much all of us do. I'm an employee of a very large organization. That organization is called basically the state government of Texas. With Texas Tech University as an intermediary. They compensate me very well. I'm able to do these things that many of us are able to do, right? I'm able to travel. I'm able to practice a musical instrument. I read. I visit. I patronize the arts. I do all these things that are good parts of a humane, flourishing life. But I also almost never talk with my neighbors because they're also doing the same thing. I think on either side of me, the house that I live in, the house to my west, has changed hands in terms of new owners 2 times in the past 3 years. That's the kind of society that these economic arrangements are necessarily conducive to. Now, where I part with the distributists and some of the small is beautiful guys is by saying that way is necessarily bad and ugly and we should do away with it. Well, no, not necessarily, because things like vaccines and literacy and all this other good stuff that we take for granted, that's pretty good too in terms of human flourishing. But we do need to take the problem seriously. Back to the land is not a solution. Just privatize everything is not a solution, because not only is it not feasible, it's contrary to the vast majority of the public's moral intuitions about the content of the good life. So this is going to require some serious thinking in terms of the moral trade-offs involved. And I don't think that the distributists give us a blueprint for solving that problem, but I do think that they provide us an architecture for thinking about what solutions have to look like. Which is why I still think that they should be read and discussed today.
Okay. What if I can ask one more big picture question? There's this question of political and economic freedom, and specifically capitalism and the problems that it can raise for political freedom. So capitalism obviously is a word that's been used in so many different ways, and people can't even seem to agree on a definition for it. I don't know how much we might want to define that a little bit, at least for the purposes of discussion. But one of the problems that we're going to be looking to someone like Ripke to help us solve on a practical level is this problem of capitalism actually tending to lead to less political freedom and these tensions between economic and political freedom. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. So the distributists were suspicious of capitalism as they understood it. They almost necessarily defined capitalism as monopoly capitalism. This idea that enterprise is necessarily concentrative, that it's necessarily going to get bigger and bigger and bigger and squeeze out, smaller scale producers. I myself don't actually think that that's how it works. I think that small scale enterprise can exist alongside large scale enterprise. And the reason for that is if you take the economics of it seriously, even a profit-maximizing corporation doesn't want to grow beyond a certain point. Why? Because it wouldn't be profitable for them to grow beyond a certain point. Right? There's a reason that lots of fast food megacorporations own land where they grow their own potatoes for their French fries, but almost none of them own cattle ranches. Why not? Because ranching is a sufficiently specialized task that it's actually cheaper for them to outsource the ranching to the people who are really good at it and just to buy the beef. Right? So from a profit maximizing standpoint, and a lot of people then will ask, well, why should we model firms as profit maximizers? Why is that the right way? Well, you assume the corporations are greedy, don't you? What does greedy mean if not profit maximizing? I think corporations are greedy. That means I think that they're profit maximizers. They're trying to make as much profit as they possibly can. So if that's your basic way of looking at the world, I think that you should be skeptical at this idea that one or a small number of businesses is going to own and dominate absolutely everything. Even multi-trillion-dollar market capitalization companies like Apple are a minuscule part of the overall global economy. So a lot of that does depend on how you define the economic systems in question. The way that I talk about them is pretty conventional. Free enterprise economies basically means a private property economy where private property can be voluntarily exchanged. Socialism means no private ownership of the factors of production. And of course, pretty much all real world economies exist somewhere in between those two poles.
Right. So why is it that there can be a tension between capitalism and political freedom as one of the costs that you have to pay for
right. Thank you for reminding me of that. Because on Belloc's way of looking at the problem, the wealth maximizing distribution of property rights in society and the liberty maximizing distribution of property rights in society can and probably do diverge. Remember, if you're thinking about liberty the way that Chesterton and Belloc are thinking about liberty, human freedom is unthinkable aside from human scale relationships, right? So if the situation arises, again, that you have people primarily taking part in economic enterprises that they themselves do not own, that they supply some specialized inputs according to a wage contract, which most of us do most of the time today. If that's the way that you're thinking about it, if that's the way that you engage the division of labor, that may very well be wealth maximizing, right? That may maximize the financial returns of your household and my neighbor's household and everybody else's household, right? But in terms of actually giving people an incentive to resist, for example, the encroachments of a higher level government that wants to centralize and agglomerate power to itself, well, you're probably going to be much more jealous of your liberty and your prerogatives if you're a property and or a business owner within a specific community rather than simply one employee among thousands of an entity that has no particular relationship to the community in which you happen to dwell. So again, it's a matter of the incentives that come from ownership. That's a hypothesis, right? That's not necessarily true. It could be wrong. I happen to think that there's a lot going for it, and we should re-examine it and think about it and how we, and by we, I'm now talking about actual economic scholars, people who study the institutions that we live under, think about some of these questions, especially in current academic controversies.
And if I'm not mistaken, part of this critique has to do with a different view of what political means. I mean, because you talk about how Chesterton and Belloc they care a lot about democracy. I tend to be a little bit skeptical of democracy in the kind of like colloquial sense of that word. But when you realize that for them, it's less important that people be voting and more important that there actually be some kind of authentic self-governance taking place and an actual meaningful and not just kind of like nominal participation in the forming of society, then the type of democracy they're talking about it's less about voting and how that works, and it's more about your actual ability to have a stake in society, and not just the individual and the state, and the individual votes and the state tallies the votes and does whatever else it does, but that there's all these other institutions involved, and there's a genuine civic society that is part of the process of governing itself, even aside from what we sort of generally call the government, in the sort of the formal sense of the state. That this government happens in all sorts of ways. It happens on the family level. It happens on the level of the firm or the union or the guild or the cooperative, whatever it is. So there's a more sort of de facto democracy that can exist that isn't really about, just this, every 4 years type of thing.
We tend to talk about democracy as what happens on election day. Chesterton and
Right.
Belloc would talk about democracy as everything that happens before and after election day. Not that voting isn't important, but to them, democracy really did mean self-governance. And so most of the
Right.
governance that we actually care about, that actually contributes to human flourishing, should probably occur in avenues outside of the state proper. And I don't mean like the state of Texas. I mean the government apparatus, the entity with a localized monopoly on the implementation of force. You should care about civic organizations. You should care about local boards. You should care about all these things that create and sustain the social capital that make communities work. And that's what Chesterton and Belloc ultimately cared about and why they valued democracy. Because they thought that without this robust civic nexus, you were not going to be able to have self-governance in any meaningful sense. Without it, governance was going to necessarily be the province of an elite, specialized few, and it was going to be something done by them to everybody else, rather than a collective or shared enterprise. And so viewed that way, their civic commitments, I think that they think that civil society is the most important thing. Civil society is even more important than politics. Civil society is even more important than markets, because that's where human flourishing and self-governance ultimately come from. They then ask the question, what do economics and politics need to look like to get us a civil society that looks the way that we want it to? And distributism is sort of their political economic answer of how we shape society that way.
Yeah. Yeah, because I was initially puzzled as to, well, how does their kind of love of democracy fit in with, say, the Thomistic view, the sort of Aristotelian Thomistic view of the different political types of political order, and
it's worth pointing out that Belloc is
preferability.
pretty explicitly a Thomist.
Right, but when you think of democracy in this sense, it's like democracy now, as we see it, it's like self-governance, meaning I'm almost like reaching up to a higher level by voting and governing myself from above in this weird kind of slightly sketchy arrangement, governing myself and others from above. Their kind of democracy, it's more like just governing yourself at the level that you're at in a subsidiary way. It's not about, trying to sort of have everybody have a say in this big picture by directly communicating with the big picture, with the highest level of government by voting. It's more about, it's more this organic kind of, you're actually just doing it by living your life in your community because of all of these levels being integrated properly.
Yeah, democracy for them is something to be lived rather than practiced on occasion. It's fundamentally non-plebiscitary. Again, voting is not unimportant. They're not going to say don't vote. They're not going to say don't have elections. They're going to say if you want the thing that happens on an election day to be meaningful, you have to get everything else right the other 364 days of the year. Govern yourself,
right, and just
govern
as
your household, take part in the civic organizations that can feed the hungry, clothe those who need clothing, do all these things. And then if there are any collective concerns left that truly are a common interest that need to be decided by the community, get everyone together and talk it out. Don't impose a solution, deliberate. Now that approach to problem solving is only going to persist, they contend, against the backdrop of a broadly distributist political and economic order.
Yeah, and just as, the powers that be may want us to be focused on income redistribution rather than, what was the term we were using? Rather than the means of production, it may also be the case that they want us to be focused on voting and politics as narrowly defined today rather than on the ability to actually live our lives with a certain degree of healthy unconcern for what's going on at those higher levels if they're actually functioning properly. Okay, so I want to, I know you want to get to Ripke. So let me ask you this question leading into that. I remember again in discussions with distributists, this claim that they would make: economics is immoral, has to be a moral science. And that you can't separate morality from economics. That's true in a certain sense and not true in another sense. So I'd like you to talk about this distinction between economics and political economy.
I think that that's a good place to start when we're engaging these particular sets of questions, because the ultimate nature of economics is going to have a lot to do with how you treat the credibility of people who say, I've studied economics, I haven't studied economics, here's how I approach these issues. I do think that there is such a thing as a science of economics. Now, by science, I don't necessarily mean experimental science, right? Hypothesize, conduct your experiment, look at the results, compare that to the hypothesis that you made. Science just means any organized body of inquiry that tells us something about some feature of reality. And so in that sense, I take a broadly classical view on what constitutes science. I would even say that ethics is a science properly understood. Now, when it comes to economics, the science of economics, I do think that the knowledge that it gives us, that is true knowledge, does not depend on any particular value judgment or value judgments, right? Suppose that you've uncovered the true theory of the world, morally speaking. You have the correct moral explanation of everything. My contention is in that world, demand curves are still going to slope down. There's still going to be an inverse relationship between the price of a good in the market and the amount of it that people want to buy. Lower price, all else being equal, people want to buy more. That's what I mean by the science of economics. We can describe markets without necessarily making a value judgment or a prescriptive statement about the way that we want markets to work or not. Right? I can tell you the way that the thing is actually going to unfold without talking about how I think it should unfold. So that first thing that I just told you, that's the science of economics. Now, why does anybody do the science of economics? Why does anybody become a doctor? Medicine is a science, but presumably you get into medicine because you care about healthy people. You want to make people healthy. You have a burning desire to improve the human condition. That's the boundary, I think, between the science of economics and the art of political economy. We engage in the art of political economy when we engage in discussions about the nature of the just or the good society. So we can and should take the science of economics and bring it to bear on the political economy, how we should, the art of political economy, how we order our common affairs to realize justice, to realize the common good. That is necessarily an ethical perspective. There is no such thing as a purely scientific way of approaching political economy because you're necessarily engaging questions that pertain to what is the proper end of human beings. So it's important that you bring economics to bear on that discussion because I would contend that the way that we ought to live has something to do with the way that we can versus cannot live, right? The constraints that we face should actually structure even our moral discourse. But the fact remains that economics by itself can answer precisely zero moral questions about the way that we want to live. If you're the second that an economist makes a policy recommendation about anything, you've stepped over the chasm from the science of economics to the art of political economy. And that's okay so long as you realize what you're doing. The problem comes when we don't realize where the boundaries between these things are and we attempt to smuggle in our value judgments that pretend that they're purely scientific. This sometimes happens when economists discuss economic efficiency. This is efficient, therefore we should do it. There's nothing controversial about efficiency. It just means maximizing wealth. Well, the problem with that is wealth in economics means people are getting what they want, and it's by no means morally obvious that people should always get what they want. People want things all the time that they shouldn't have, and that it would be immoral to give it to them. So we can't, throw up our hands and say efficiency can take care of everything. Some economists, unfortunately, do say that.
I remember reading several years ago Murray Rothbard's Man, Economy and State and Power and Market, and I remember noting at the time that in Man, Economy and State, he makes all of these careful distinctions between the is and the ought of economics, and then in Power and Market, he kind of proceeds to make assumptions as though, the efficiency is what matters. You can see him crossing that boundary to make his political points in Power and Market, even though he's acknowledged the illegitimacy of crossing that boundary in some of his other writings. So that's an important problem. The other thing I wanted to mention, another great economist, Hayek, there's this famous quote from him. He says, "The curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design."
Yes.
And that quote can be taken in a couple of ways. It can be taken in a kind of a libertarian biased way, where you say, well, economics just shows you that, state policy can't actually accomplish anything good. because we can't really predict how anything's going to turn out. But there's also a sense that it is true, and it also explains some of the frustration from all quarters at economists when they're telling you, well, actually, no, just because you intend that result doesn't mean you're going to get that result. And I think that accounts, I mean, I think there's legitimate frustration from the distributist world at economists, but I think that there's also that bit of frustration that we have when somebody is telling us, well, no, it's not that simple, actually, and you can't just do that by saying that's what's going to happen with this or that policy. You can't, intentions don't equal results, as the Austrians are so fond of telling us.
That's right. That's one of my favorite Hayek quotes, and I think that rather than as a justification for libertarianism, I think the right way to understand him there as part of his broader scholarly project of using human reason to discipline the claims of human reason. And so in that sense, he's sort of carrying forward the sort of Burkean project in political economy, not in the sense of like a values-based conservatism, but simply showing why we can't actually control as much as we might like to control. So his mentor and greatest teacher, Ludwig von Mises, has this quote, and I don't remember it exactly, but it goes something along the lines of, nobody likes talking to economists at parties because we tell people that they can't do whatever they want to do, right? An economist will never be welcome in the halls of power because we're always telling people,
right,
hey, you have this utopia in mind, but there are these things called constraints that means that we can't have all of what we want. So that's going to be a problem. There's another Hayek quote of which I'm particularly fond. Basically, he says that, I'm trying to remember it, this might not be an exact quote, but it'll be closer than the other one. Nobody can be an economist. Nobody can be a good economist who is only an economist. So Hayek himself was a big proponent of this idea that if you wanted to be good at economics, if you wanted to practice the science responsibly, you needed to study history, sociology, psychology, ethical philosophy, all the humane disciplines that matter for human beings. Because what are we studying? Human beings. That's what economics is, the study of man in one particular facet of life, right? Acting man.
Right.
So you can't make serious advancements in human knowledge about the ways that human beings act without taking these other disciplines under your wing as you formulate your hypotheses. It's important to take a holistic perspective on the science of man.
So Ripke, you talked about his career and some reasons that he's credible. I mean, he is not just an economist who told people what they couldn't do. He actually did help people to do things, as you pointed out, in Germany. And I don't know if you mentioned this already, but he was explicitly inspired by the Distributists, right?
Yes, he was. There's a portion of the book where I repeat a vignette that he himself tells in one of his books. He's apparently speaking to a German welfare bureaucrat, somebody whose job it is to shuffle around purchasing power, to cut checks. And Repke, starts taking the distributist line saying, you can't just think about cutting somebody a check. You have to think about dignity. You have to think about ownership. You have to give people a way to sustainably engage the division of labor. To which the welfare bureaucrat replies in a somewhat bewildered manner, why, you are a Catholic, aren't you? And of course, Repke is not a Catholic. He just takes Catholic social teaching very seriously. And he responds, one does not need to be a Catholic to see things this way.
You said he was a Lutheran, right?
He was Protestant. I don't actually know specifically what denomination he was.
Okay.
Off the top of my head.
This is a broad question, but what are some of the ways in which distributism and the insights of economic science were merged by Ripke?
So I think he does it by basically taking the distinction between the science of economics and the art of political economy very seriously. And this is actually something that's demonstrated by his own scholarly works. Like many economists, Ripke wrote an introductory economics text, right? Markets and what you need to know about them. That's not the title, but it's basically the content of the book. And if you go and read that book, what's striking is how similar that book is, written 70 plus years ago, to contemporary introductory economics textbooks. The importance of property rights, the role of the price system in coordinating production, the effects of public policy on the market, how monetary policy works, international trade, all this stuff that's part of the economist's basic scientific toolkit in terms of how we analyze things, Rupke brooked no nonsense in this area. He very clearly thought that there was such a thing as the economic way of thinking, that you had to get it right because getting it right provided us true knowledge of the world that you couldn't get any other way. But then you broaden out and you read his books like A Humane Economy, which is very much a work, a social philosophical work in the area of political economy. And that's where he's putting the distributist stuff to work in ways that he thinks are commensurate with the science of economics, right? In other words, things that are means ends consistent. He's picking policies that he thinks will actually accomplish the goals that he wants. He talks about property preserving policies. He talks about controlling monopolies. He talks about all these things that are necessary, he believes, to maintaining politics and economics at a human scale. Now, the only way that you're going to get that is if you get the economics right, because you need to make sure that the policies that you actually adopt are appropriate for attaining the goals that you seek. The way that Rupke talks about it is like this. Economics tells me about the relationship between means and ends. If you want X, do Y. Economics cannot say one thing, one iota, about whether Y is worth having. But that's the ultimate conversation we're all engaged in, right? The final conversation, the ultimate purpose of this is to figure out how to live well. So the science of economics really is in service of the art of political economy in Rupke. And I think that that's the right way of doing this. Not in the sense that we preordain our conclusions and try and shoehorn our scientific statements into value judgments, but in the sense that if we want to actually realize, incarnate, institutionalize our values, we had better be sure that we know how to actually achieve them, what works and what doesn't.
Right. And this is a way of getting what the distributists are hoping for, a moral economics, without kind of blurring the lines such that you're not even able to talk about cause and effect without somebody yelling at you and saying, you must be this soulless, atomizing, whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So let me ask a practical question, and this goes back to the topic of land. So I was talking about some of the issues with people being detached from the land. One that I've heard raised recently is the idea that people don't really have any metaphysical grounding if they're too sort of detached from the basic sources of life. And that kind of lends itself to all sorts of errors about metaphysics and the purpose of life. But there's a more practical issue. I mean, people have been concerned, say, about, is it BlackRock buying up all of this land and all of this real estate in the U.S. So in terms of political freedom, there is this issue that if not everybody, but if a certain number of people are not sort of living on the land and having control over farming, small farmers, independent farmers, then we risk having all of that controlled by, the government or large corporations, at which point it doesn't really matter how many of the other factors of production people own, because you need the land to make food. And so, how would someone like Rupke solve that problem without just saying, well, everybody should go back to being a self-sufficient small farmer?
Rupke himself was very clear on believing the government had a role in policing market power, which in economics terms basically means the ability of businesses to charge prices in excess of costs, the kinds of costs that matter for bringing more of the goods and services to market. And so that might be one thing that Rupke would pursue. I would actually be more inclined to think about this in a bottom-up fashion. Why is BlackRock doing this, and why is it working? Because most of us simply want to live in as cheap a house as possible, rented, buying, the circumstances can be different depending on our own particular circumstance, our own, historical background or whatever. Right. And we don't much care where the housing comes from, and we don't much care who governs it. If that's actually true, if we're just about minimizing our monthly rental payment or minimizing our monthly mortgage payment, then yeah, we should probably outsource everything to the large property developers, and Washington, D.C. should probably set down all the rules for making that happen. Mm-hmm. If that's what you want, yeah, that's probably the most efficient arrangement, right? See, what's efficient versus not efficient ultimately depends on the kinds of values that you want to embody. Rupke would point out, though, that in that world, there's not going to be any meaningful thing as self-governance. There just isn't going to be. If governance basically means where the rules of the game come from, governing is going to be done by something else. One of them is going to be a nominally private entity like a large developer, BlackRock or something like that. Another one is going to be the government. But actual citizens who live in the community are basically going to pay their price and then go about their business. Mm-hmm. For a lot of people, that's okay. And it's not hard to understand why. It minimizes their payments, which means that they have more resources left over to do other things. And maybe they're doing morally praiseworthy things with those other resources. We can't say in the abstract. It's entirely possible that they can live more humane, flourishing lives because they do that. But we also need to recognize that something is being forsaken in doing that.
Right.
And when enough people make that choice, it's necessarily going to infringe on the communal values, on the civics associations, on the fundamental aspects of self-governance that we talked about before. Right. And this is something that I think that Chesterton is particularly eloquent on. In his writings, he says that if a thing worth doing, it's worth doing badly. We shouldn't outsource everything to the experts, even if they're good at it, especially if they're good at it. Governing is not a thing like playing an instrument. It's good and proper that we outsource playing the piano or playing the cello to experts and go see them at concerts, because that's an artistic, beautiful thing, and it's okay that not every one of us can do that. But governing isn't like that. Governing is one of those things that we expect everybody to be able to do for themselves, even if they aren't particularly good at it. Because deliberating the laws of the land, the basic conditions under which we as a community live, is something intrinsic to us being human. And so I think that Chesterton's liberalism actually shines through there, because that's a very small L liberal point. Of course, a very Catholic point too.
Right.
So if we actually care about those values, we have to be skeptical of these processes, and we personally have to be willing to pay a cost to live the way that it needs to happen. Right? We can't just count on Uncle Sam like changing the rules of the game to make it easier for us. You have to be consciously willing to not maximize your household wealth if you want to live these ways. And that's a very tall order. Right. That's what Belloc and Chesterton meant by inculcating an ownership mindset, an ownership way of living.
And looking at it from that bottom up perspective, though, it kind of brings us back to, not everybody has to be. I mean, I certainly don't plan on probably ever being a farmer in any significant sense. But if we're not going to have just a few people controlling the whole food supply, then that means that at least what you might call a critical mass or a significant minority of people would have to choose to live that life, because otherwise, there's going to be just a few large concerns controlling the food supply. So it does seem like there does need to be, just as you can have some people be renters, but it's important to have more people be owners. It does seem like there needs to be more small, people than there are now doing these things and living on the land and being independent, so that you can have that kind of that freeholder mentality among enough people, and also more practically to just not have the food supply controlled by a few large corporations or by the government. It seems like it's inevitable that if we're looking at it at that small scale, bottom up perspective, then it does come down to some people just have to choose to live that lifestyle, even if it's not practical for society as a whole to go back to that.
I think at the founding of the United States, roughly 90% of the population was involved in agricultural production. Today, that number is something like 2 to 3%. And yet, in terms of actual calories produced, we're on an order of millions to millions times as many. We can sustain a population that in previous generations was simply unfathomable. You're not going to be able to feed 350 million Americans and 8 billion people in the world if everybody's a homesteader. So I think that we have to get that out of our head. At the same time, maybe wanting some resilience, maybe having some people responsible for some part of the process in a way that inculcates an ownership mentality, maybe there's room for that. We should not diminish the humanitarian benefits of some of these large-scale production processes. I think that one of the things that distributism gets wrong is that it tends to miss those. It's so focused on small is beautiful that it overlooks the fact that there are billions of people in the world who today enjoy humane, comfortable lives, who, if we tried to go back to the methods of production in the early 19th century, would literally starve to death. That's clearly not morally acceptable if you care about human flourishing and human dignity. At the same time, what we have right now poses its own problems. An economist of whom I'm very fond, Thomas Sowell, famously said, "There are no solutions, only trade-offs." So I think that the way to think about this is the distributists help us understand some of the moral trade-offs in a way that we would otherwise miss. We might tend to be too Panglossian about this than we would be otherwise.
Right. And that probably on its own will motivate at least some people to actually uproot their lives and root them somewhere, root them in a different way, even if not everybody. And it'll make everybody else just more aware of these problems so they won't be so quick to just uncritically embrace this kind of arrangement where eventually somebody can tell you you're not eating meat anymore and you just have to go along with it.
It's going to be small scale science. It's going to be people who grew up in small towns consciously deciding I'm not going to live in Los Angeles or New York City. I'm going back to the town that I'm raised. It's also going to happen in higher stakes things, right? Show me the last time the governor of a state refused federal money for something. Everyone talks about a big game of protecting the prerogatives of their state, and yet when the Washington's purse opens, the governors are the ones with the first ones with their hands in the purse. There's a reason that the founders refer to the power of the purse, because money is dependence and dependence is control. So show me a governor who's going to actually look to Washington and say, no, thank you. We're going to finance all this stuff ourselves because it's our job and that's how we want to live. Until and unless you're willing to do that, I don't want to hear anything about protecting states' rights or state prerogatives.
Is there anything else any other examples you'd like to give of Ripke's work in terms of merging the economist and the distributist perspectives?
Ripke does a great job of carrying it forward. I would really encourage everybody, if you want to get the most out of the distributist, you should go into it with a basic working knowledge of economics. That doesn't mean that you have to study economics in a college course. You don't even have to take an online course. Just read a couple of introductory economics books. Not even a textbook, right? There's plenty of wonderful introductions to the economic way of thinking that are readable. The prose is great. They're not, they're not dry, cut and dry textbooks. You need a basic
Any particular recommendations?
Sorry?
Any particular recommendations?
Matthew Hennessy has an interesting recent book. He's one of the deputy editors of the opinion page at the Wall Street Journal that basically conveys some introductory economics lessons. An economist named Russ Roberts has written very good economics primers. If you are looking for something a little more systematic, there's always the immortal Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt from the early 20th century. I actually think that Ripke's price theory textbook, his introductory economics textbook, is pretty good still, even today, if you're into that sort of thing. So again, if you want a textbook, you can find it. If you want something more digestible, you can find that too. Because unless you have a basic understanding of where market prices come from and how supply and demand works, you're not going to be able to parse what the distributists say to figure out what's valuable and enduring from their works versus what's kind of a dead end. And I contend that there is lots that's good and valuable in their works that we should continue to wrestle with today. We shouldn't discard all of them. In fact, we shouldn't discard most of them. But nonetheless, there are lots of dead ends there. People can read Chesterton, they can and should read Belloc, and they should read scientific economics too, because that's how we get all the things that we want.
I have a question that may be not possible to answer in this conversation, so tell me if it's not possible. But you mentioned Ripke being a subjectivist in economics, a marginalist. But one critique you hear about from the Austrian school from distributist types is that it's contrary to a Catholic realist perspective. In other words, just to give people an example without explaining, the marginal revolution to people in technical terms, but this idea that the price of a good is basically just determined by supply and demand, and there's no sort of like inherent value that it has that would correspond to economic. Not that there's no inherent value that it has, but that whatever metaphysical value, ontological value that thing might have doesn't correspond to a particular objective economic value. That's a thing that the distributists have a big problem with. They say that it is this kind of like anti-realist position, basically. So how might you respond to that? I mean, is there a way to respond to that and make the proper distinction so that there is still some kind of connection between something's sort of metaphysical real being and its price? and that also comes into play with the Catholic idea of the just price. I mean, you can look at the just wage and look at it in terms of what's necessary for a man to support his family. That's a criterion given in the early social encyclicals. But then if you're looking at the just price for goods, it would seem that the assumption, at least by critics of economics, would be that has to have some grounding in the actual metaphysical value of a thing.
That's a very important point, and I'm glad that you brought it up. My simple answer is that methodological subjectivism is not metaphysical subjectivism. They're different things. If I want to explain the price of bread, I have to make recourse to the values that the people who are trading in the bread market actually hold. What are buyers of bread willing to pay? What are sellers of bread willing to sell it for? Even if we hypothesize that there is a just price at which bread should trade, that's not going to impose itself on reality automatically, right? The trades that people make are going to be based on their own preferences and their own values and their own trade-offs. That's what subjective value means, right? For the purposes of explaining why the world is the way it is, we need to take people as they are. So again, it's purely descriptive. You can have a supply and demand subjectivist story about the price of bread while also having a metaphysically realist perspective on what the just price of bread ought to be. Right? One does not preclude the other. One is explanatory. The other one is prescriptive. Right? The idea that we want it to be this way when it in fact is not. So I don't think that there's any.
I guess what the Austrians would say, is there's no rational way to determine what the just price should be, because prices are all relative to people's desires, and so they would say that's just an incoherent thing to even attempt. Would be to look at it in metaphysical terms. So I guess I suppose that even
for the record, if that's the objection that the economists make, then that's wrong too. Right?
Yeah.
So it's one thing to say, I can explain the price of bread based on people's subjective preferences and desires. Subjective just means relative to a subject. It doesn't mean not real. It means what are the trade-offs that the buyer is willing to make? Right? Not me, the social scientist, imposing my values there, but the actual people I'm studying. So if I'm explaining the price of bread, supply and demand, subjective value, great. If I reason from that and say, because I have this explanatory apparatus of subjectivism, if I use that to argue that there's no such thing as a concrete real value there, that's an unjustified inference. You can't make that leap. It may be the case that—
I guess they would say that there's no actual scientific way to determine it, whether it exists or not.
That depends on whether you think ethics is a science or not. But once you start doing morality, you're doing a different kind of science, I would contend.
Yeah.
Right?
So how do you think, I mean, again, this is a difficult question to answer on the spot, but how do you think that somebody might go about, I mean, how could you translate that into dollars and cents terms in the first place? Or is it more that you would have to go back and look at it in terms of bartering, not to actually return to bartering, practically speaking, but to look at it in terms of what do these dollars and cents actually get you in different goods? And if the same amount of dollars and cents gets you one thing that has, much lower metaphysical value than the other thing that it would get you, then there's something off in the price determination or something. I'm just curious how that would translate.
You could conceptually have a morally realist theory that says the price of bread relative to all other goods for various reasons of justice should be X. You should be able to do that while also explaining why the price of the bread in the world right now is other than X. Supply and demand, as economists understand it and practice it, is how we explain actually existing prices. There is no intellectual contradiction between having a descriptive theory that rests on subjective value and a moral theory that rests on realist metaphysical value. Right. Now, how you actually do that depends on what value judgments you bring to your ethical analysis, right? I mean, you could have a very rigid idea, the price of bread should be this, and or else the heavens should fall. Or you could take a perspective like the scholastics in the 16th century in Spain, where they basically arrive at a theory very much like the just price is whatever is voluntary arrived at on the market. You could have a moral theory that looks either of those ways. You could have a completely different moral theory. The point is, whatever
Right.
moral theory you have, that does not impinge on my ability to describe the price arising from the actual value judgments of people on the ground as they actually are.
Yeah. And it seems like we have to come back to that distinction then.
Yeah, think
between
about it this way.
economics and
I can
political
speak
economy.
meaningfully about the market for prostitution without thinking that prostitution is a good thing that should be done.
Right.
To use a rather stark
Yeah.
example.
Well, you mentioned that School of Salamanca idea from the 16th century. I mean the Catholic Church, Catholic social teaching does explicitly condemn the idea that the just price is necessarily whatever the market arrives at. Certainly with the cases of wages, above all, they would say that. But that, yeah. So that seems to be a case where it's a certain sort of road is closed off.
I bring it up as an example of a
science.
moral theory because what counts as a market
Right,
also
right,
depends
right.
on the distribution of property rights. You could
Okay.
give all the water in the world to Mark Zuckerberg, and then Mark Zuckerberg would charge a monopoly price for water for everybody to drink so that they would not die of thirst. Would that be a just arrangement, even though it was quote unquote voluntarily arrived at? Pretty obvious to see why not. Right? But that's also not what I think the guys at the School of Salamanca are saying. So I think if someone were to characterize their view as that would be a straw man.
Right. I mean, I think people in the Thomistic tradition would generally say, at the very least, around the just price of any given thing, there's sort of like a range of fluctuation that's acceptable based on those market forces of supply and demand. At the very least, they would have, to be any kind of realist, worthy of the name, you would have to admit that at the very least. Okay, well, Alex, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. This was great.
It was my pleasure, Thomas. Thanks and God bless you.
Yeah, I haven't actually read any economic theory basically since I stopped being a libertarian, so it was nice to sort of return to the topic. Again, people, the book is The Political Economy of Distributism, Property, Liberty, and the Common Good. It's out from Catholic University of America Press. I will link to that in the show notes. Thank you, everybody, for listening. If you would like to find some great Catholic resources, everything from news, commentary, liturgical year information, a great library of Catholic documents, I encourage you to go to catholicculture.org, and I encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter so you can keep abreast of all of our new podcasts, articles, important news stories. And we have a number of different email signups you can do where you can get, what is the feast day of the day, or what are the feast days coming up for the next week, so you can prep your family liturgical celebrations in the home and things like that. So again, catholicculture.org, and you can sign up for our email list there, which I highly recommend. Thanks everybody for listening, and I'll see you next time.
The Catholic Culture Podcast is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Way of the Fathers, an early church history podcast hosted by Mike Aquilina, Catholic Culture audiobooks bringing to life classic Catholic writings, and Criteria, the Catholic film podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.